In the gloomy silence of the night highway, the car's headlights cut through the thick fog like a knife through dense fabric. Sarah held the steering wheel tighter than usual, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue. She only had 30 miles to drive to the nearest motel, where she planned to spend the night, but the time dragged on for an excruciatingly long time. The road seemed endless. There were no streetlights outside, just empty fields and dark silhouettes of forests. The radio suddenly began to hiss, losing its signal. "Damn," she muttered, turning off the radio. And at the same moment, the car jerked forward, and then stalled, as if the life had suddenly been drained from it. Sarah tried to start the engine again, but he just coughed plaintively. The silence around them became deafening. She picked up the phone, but then realized that she had no signal. Panic began to rise in waves. Sarah got out of the car, trying to calm herself down. It's just a simple breakdown, she thought. She didn't notice anything strange under the hood, but she didn't know much about it. Faint lights in the distance caught her attention. A house? Is there a phone in there? The road to the lights was long and strangely quiet. Sarah could clearly hear her footsteps on the gravel, and then there was a rustle behind her. She turned around, but saw nothing but fog. Her heart sped up, but she continued on her way. The closer she got to the lights, the more they looked like candlelight. Soon, a view opened up in front of her, an old gas station with a time-worn store. The windows were dirty, and the lights inside were flickering. "Hey, is anyone there?" Sarah called, coming closer. Silence answered her. The door of the store was ajar, and a light draft was moving it back and forth. She took a step inside. The floors were covered with a layer of dust, as if no one had entered in years. The shelves with the goods were empty, but on one of them there was an ancient cash register, as if someone had recently used it. There was a hastily written note on the counter. "Don't stop. Don't look back. They're always watching." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Suddenly, she heard the sound of tires screeching outside. She ran outside and saw that her car, left on the side of the road, was slowly rolling towards the road. "How?" she whispered, rushing to run. But when she reached the place where she had left the car, it was gone. There were only tire tracks on the asphalt, as if the car had driven off on its own in an unknown direction. Sarah looked back towards the gas station and saw that the lights were on again, even though everything had gone out a few seconds ago. There was something new written on the glass. "You shouldn't have gotten out of the car." Sarah's breathing hitched. She wanted to scream, but something held her back. She heard soft laughter coming from the depths of the forest surrounding the road. Now she knew she wasn't alone. "Don't stop. Don't look back," she reminded herself, taking off and running away from the gas station. All she knew was that staying here meant death. Sarah ran as fast as she could. The fog was getting thicker by the second, and she had to strain her eyes to stay on the road. Her heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of her chest, but fear was driving her faster than fatigue could make her stop. There was a sound behind him. Heavy footsteps, fast, clear. Someone was following her. She didn't dare look back, remembering the ominous words on the note. "Don't stop. Don't look back." But where to run to? Without a car, without communication, in the middle of a deserted highway surrounded by forest, she was in full view. The fog was thickening, but it didn't hide her. She felt someone's eyes burning into her back. Soon, Sarah saw a dark silhouette ahead. He was standing right in the middle of the road, motionless like a statue. She froze. The figure didn't move, but there was something unnaturally strange about it. There was an object in the man's hands, like a metal rod or a crowbar. Sarah tried to make out his face, but the fog hid the details. "Hey, who are you? I need help." "Stop it," she shouted, taking an unsteady step forward. The silhouette was silent. And suddenly there was distant laughter, but not from him. Laughter echoed from all sides, as if someone was mocking her attempts to find salvation. The figure stepped forward, and Sarah noticed that he was wearing dirty, blood-stained clothes. She stepped back, but then she heard rustling behind her. She didn't dare look back, afraid that it would turn out to be a trap. "Don't come any closer." "Stop it!" she shouted, trying to give her voice the confidence she no longer had. The man stopped, and then abruptly raised his hand and pointed somewhere to the left. Sarah didn't understand the gesture, but there was only one thought in her head: to run. She rushed over the side of the road towards the forest, not understanding the road. Branches whipped at her face, her clothes clung to the bushes, but she continued to rush forward. Soon she came to a small clearing where an old, abandoned house stood. The front door was torn off its hinges, and the windows were boarded up. Sarah didn't know which was worse, staying outside or going inside. But there was another sound of footsteps behind them. She ran into the house without hesitation. It smelled damp and rotten inside. The floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were pocked with deep scratches, as if someone had clawed them out from the inside. Dirty knives lay on the kitchen table, and there was a puddle of dark, already dried liquid in the corner. There was a board with crooked inscriptions on the wall. She came closer and saw the list. Her name was the first. There were dozens more names under it, some crossed out in blood-red paint. She barely had time to realize what was happening when she heard something heavy hit the floor behind her. Sarah slowly turned around. There was a man standing in the doorway. It was the same silhouette, but now his face was illuminated by the moon. A wide, lopsided grin stretched across his dirty face. He was holding a crowbar in his hands. "I found it," he muttered, his voice rough, as if he hadn't spoken in years. Sarah rushed upstairs, realizing that she was just delaying the inevitable. There were several rooms on the second floor. All of them looked equally ruined. She ran into the nearest one, locked the door, and pressed her back against it to hold it. Footsteps sounded below. They were heavy, hollow, like hammer blows. The man walked slowly, delighting in prolonging the moment. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, trying to breathe more quietly. Suddenly, she noticed another door in the room, a small closet. She froze, hesitating, but the sound of footsteps grew closer. With trembling hands, she opened the closet and climbed inside, closing the door behind her. From there, she could see a man enter the room. He stopped in the middle of the room, looking around. His heavy breathing filled the air. Sarah tried not to breathe. He walked over to the bed, squatted down and looked under it. Then he slowly stood up. "Do you think you can hide?" he said hoarsely, coming closer to the closet. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the worst. The man stood at the cupboard, slowly bringing a crowbar to the door, as if preparing to rip it out with meat. Sarah felt panic tearing at her from the inside out. She couldn't hide anymore and decided to act while she was still alive. Looking around, she felt something heavy in the closet, a rusty pipe or a piece of metal. He reached for his pen. Sarah didn't think. She just hit with as much force as she was capable of. The crowbar fell from his hands, and he staggered back, cursing her with all his might. She rushed to the door, knocking him over with her shoulder, and ran downstairs, stumbling on every step. Sarah knew that there was no time. The man recovered quickly. She noticed the front door, but when she reached it, she found that it was propped up by a heavy cabinet. Sarah turned around. Her gaze fell on the open trapdoor in the floor leading to the basement. It was her only chance. She grabbed the crowbar that the man had dropped and ducked into the dark passage, closing the heavy lid behind her. The basement was damp and smelled of mold. But the worst part was that the light from her phone picked out creepy details from the darkness. Rusty hooks suspended from chains, bloodstains on the floor, and old plastic containers covered with lids. Sarah walked slowly over to one of the containers, hoping it was just tools or trash. But when she opened it, she almost threw up. Inside was a dismembered body part. Bandages, bottles with some unknown liquids and used syringes were lying nearby. She was horrified, but she realized that this place was not just a killer's lair. It was a kind of makeshift laboratory. She noticed several more containers that contained chemicals. The labels on the bottles were not familiar to her, but the strong smell made her dizzy. Suddenly, there was a crash from above as the manhole cover opened. "You think you're going to hide from me in my basement?" A man's voice rang out. Sarah rushed into the depths, grabbing everything that came to hand. Iron cans, pieces of wood, bottles. She found an old vent and tried to open it, but the grill was bolted shut. The footsteps were getting closer. The man walked slowly down the stairs, humming a strange tune to himself. "You're not the first. But I promise, you will be the most memorable," he said, laughing out loud. Sarah threw one of the bottles in his direction, aiming at his head. The bottle smashed against the wall, and the man instantly disappeared in a cloud of chemical smoke. He coughed, clutching his face. She rushed to the ventilation grate and, using all her strength, was able to tear it off. The narrow tunnel left her no choice. Sarah squeezed into him, crawling forward. But when she got to the exit, she realized that her nightmare wasn't over yet. There was another exit to the forest behind the ventilation system, but there was a huge truck parked here. Its back doors were open, and inside she saw cages, chains, and strange tools. There were bodies in the corner, several dead people. She heard voices in the distance. It wasn't just one person. Sarah froze, her heart pounding, and her thoughts were confused. She looked at the cages, at the bodies in the corner, and realized that she had become a part of something much more than just a victim of this maniac. She was at the epicenter of a horrific conspiracy in which death traps and cruel experiments had become the norm. But this truck, this could be her last chance to get out. She had to act quickly. Going to the back doors, Sarah carefully peered around the corner. The voices were getting closer. Running her eyes over the truck, she noticed several old cash registers covered with rusty sheets of metal, and a bunch of tools that were probably used to keep the victims in line. In the midst of all this chaos, she noticed something else, a mobile camera that looked like the result of a prepared plan. She was connected to some kind of long wires, which may have recorded information about her actions. Sarah felt her legs begin to give way. Everything seemed shaky, dangerous, and so unreliable. In a panic, she glanced at the cages. There was a woman lying in one of them, obviously dead. In another, a girl was sitting with her face in her hands. Her breathing was heavy, and her body was trembling. She was still alive, but her condition indicated that she had experienced something terrible. Sarah walked over to the cage and gently knocked on it, trying to get her attention. "Are you alive?" "What is it?" she whispered. The girl raised her head. Her eyes were full of fear and pain. She didn't say anything, just nodded, confirming that she was still alive, but there was something frightening in her gaze, complete despair, as if she had already lost all hope of salvation. Sarah felt herself losing strength, but she knew that if she didn't help this girl, she wouldn't be able to leave here alive. Sarah looked around, and noticing several iron bars that could be used to crack the lock of the cage, she got down to business. She had to act fast, otherwise she would become a part of this nightmare too. She used a crowbar and a pair of steel bars to move the lock, and finally the cage door opened. The girl got to her feet in a panic, but then her legs gave out and she almost fell. Sarah caught her, supporting her by the shoulders. "You need to come with me." "We can get out," Sarah said, although she doubted they had a chance. The girl nodded with difficulty and followed her. They made their way through the truck, running around various objects, trying not to attract attention. However, the sound of their footsteps when they reached the door itself did not go unnoticed. Suddenly, a sharp sound came from the darkness. "Who's there?" She heard a voice familiar from the fears she had endured. It was a man. Sarah tried to pull the girl, but she suddenly froze, staring into the darkness. She clutched her hand and whispered, "I can't. I can't escape." The man appeared in the doorway. He was holding a shovel in his hands, and his face was contorted with an evil grin. His gaze darted between the girl and Sarah realized that he was determined now. He raised the shovel, and there was cruelty in his eyes. "You're not leaving me. This is where you belong. We'll make something beautiful out of you," he said, coming up step by step. Sarah quickly assessed the situation. There was no chance of them. The only way out is to stop him before he gets too close. Her heart was pounding, but her survival instinct took over. She forcefully kicked a steel beam that was standing nearby, and it shot up into the air, hitting the man squarely in the face. He staggered back, crying out in pain, but it was enough for Sarah and the girl to slip out the window and out into the woods. The darkness enveloped them, but they ran without stopping until they fell into the thick bushes, hiding in the shadows. In the dark, Sarah couldn't figure out where they were. The only thing she knew was that they weren't safe. Sarah and the girl continued to run through the forest, trying not to make unnecessary noises. They made their way through the dark undergrowth, their breathing harsh and their hearts pounding with fear. Sarah's mind was still filled with the horror of what they had just gone through, but she tried not to think about it, trying to focus on surviving. The girl she had saved was walking beside her, supporting her, but there was no joy on her face, only fatigue and fear. But after a while, when they began to feel that they had moved away from danger a little, the darkness around them became less threatening. The forest became a little quieter, and somewhere in the distance you could hear the murmur of a stream. Sarah slowed her pace and looked back at her companion, noticing that her face had become a little softer, although there was still a trace of fear in her eyes. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked softly, looking around. The girl looked at her gratefully and narrowed her eyes a little, as if not quite believing that they really got out. She nodded and replied, "Yes, it's simple. I can't believe we're here. We're alive." Sarah smiled faintly, feeling her tension go away a little. She reached out her hand, trying to support the girl, and at that moment their eyes met. For Sarah, it was like the first moment of calmness all night. Something jumped in her chest. It was a strange feeling, as if they had found each other in this abyss of horrors. She didn't know what would happen next, but at that moment, she felt like some kind of bond was forming between them. "We survived," Sarah said, trying not to think about the fact that they were still not safe. "But we need to find shelter. The forest is big, and we can't stay here." The girl nodded, but her gaze became a little thoughtful. It seems that she was also surprised that, despite all the horrors, they did not feel despair, but on the contrary, somehow became closer to each other. They found a small clearing where they could rest and decided to stop. Sarah built a small fire using the branches left over from the collapsed trees. The flames lit up with a dim light, and a warm but still unsettling atmosphere appeared around them. The girl was sitting opposite, her face illuminated by the soft light of the fire. She stared into the fire as if trying to forget herself. "Thank you for saving me," she said softly. I do not know what would have happened to me if you had not come." Sarah sighed and looked at her. The girl's words touched her, and she felt her heart soften a little. There had been many difficult moments in her life, but none of them seemed as important as this one. It was about helping someone, becoming someone's support. "We couldn't leave you there." "I couldn't leave you," Sarah replied, and then paused. "Do you want to tell me how you got here?" The girl did not immediately respond, but her gaze became deeper and more hazy. "My name was Lena. I worked at a local hospital. One day this man came to work, and I had to examine him. At first, I didn't notice anything suspicious, but then he started appearing more often. I was scared at first, but I couldn't do anything. And then I ended up here. He kept me locked up, and it was so hard to even think about running away." Lena fell silent. Her gaze became clouded, as if she was reliving these moments. Sarah could feel her pain and fear. She had also been through a lot in her life, but this nightmare was different. Here in the forest, they were more vulnerable than ever. Suddenly, something broke their brief moment of calm. Lena froze, listening, and Sarah instantly felt a shiver run through her skin. Somewhere in the distance, a strange sound was heard. It wasn't a step, it wasn't the sound of the wind. It was something harsh, unnatural. Sarah and Lena turned in the direction of the noise at the same time. The fire crackled, but there was silence again. Then they heard footsteps, not just footsteps, but heavy ones, sure that someone knew they were here. Sarah clutched onto a rock that was lying by the campfire, ready to defend herself and Lena. "That's the man. He was close. Do you think you've run away?" His voice came from the shadows. "I'll always find you." "You haven't figured out what the mistake is yet, Sarah." The voice they heard from the shadows was hoarse, as if from the mouth of a man who had long since lost the remnants of humanity. He sounded confident and ominous. When Sarah and Lena turned, the shadow gradually became clearer, and a moment later, the same man appeared out of the darkness. He stood almost motionless, with a pistol in his hands and a human head in his other hand. She hung like a mutilated trophy, dead eyes staring lifelessly in their direction. Sarah felt her blood freeze in her veins. At first, she couldn't believe what she saw. The head was crucified in parts, and her face was distorted, as if it had become a part of this terrible world. Sarah and Lena looked at this scene in horror, realizing that the man was not just a maniac, but some kind of evil incarnation that they would not be able to stop. The man laughed softly, and his laughter echoed in the silence of the night. He took a step forward, the gun pointed straight at them. "You thought I wouldn't find you," he said, looking at Sarah. You can't run away from me. We've been playing cat and mouse for a long time, and I've almost finished my game." Sarah clenched her fists, trying to control the panic that was starting to burst inside her again. She looked around, her mind desperately searching for a way out. Lena was in such a state that she could barely stand on her feet. There was no hope or will to live in her eyes. She looked at this nightmarish scene as the inevitable end. The man took another step, getting closer to them. He seemed confident, as if he was the hunter and they were his victims. "You don't understand," he continued, slowly approaching. "I knew you'd resist. But this only adds to the intrigue. Do you see how I'm changing? How will your death become more painful each time?" Sarah felt her palm slide over the stone she was holding. Her heart was beating so hard in her chest that she could hear it even in her ears. She took a step back, hiding behind Lena. Her fingers tightened on the cold handle. There was no time, no choice. The man stopped, his gaze cold and sharp like a knife blade. "I've always been there for you," he said, smiling ominously. "But you've been trying to escape for too long. The time has come." Sarah looked around in desperation, and suddenly noticed several stones scattered near the campfire. One of them was quite large. Without hesitation, she grabbed it and, with a scream, threw it at the man, trying to distract him at least for a moment. A stone hit him on the chest, and he staggered back, losing his balance. The gun tore out of his hands, and while he was trying to get it back into his fingers, Sarah grabbed Lena's arm and yanked her towards the woods. They didn't turn around, they just ran, feeling like every step they took could be their last. The firelight was left behind, disappearing into the shadows. The sound of his laughter did not subside in their ears, getting closer and closer. But fear wouldn't let them stop. Sarah and Lena were running, their own pulse was thundering in their ears, as if each heartbeat was stronger than the previous one, and with each step their legs became heavier. Lena could barely keep up with Sarah, stumbling over roots and rocks, but she didn't dare slow down. She couldn't afford to think about what was going on around her. The only thought that remained in her mind was to survive. The darkness swallowed them up, and the light from the campfire gradually disappeared, leaving them in a complete abyss. The stars in the sky barely broke through the clouds, and the rustling in the forest only increased the feeling that they were not alone. They were running, not knowing where, only striving to move on from the horror that they had just experienced. And suddenly, a figure appeared ahead. Sarah froze in her tracks, and fear was reflected in her eyes. But it wasn't the shadow of a murderer. It was a man. She couldn't make out who he was, but he was standing in the semi-darkness, and his figure was too big to be a friend. Lena clung to her hand, squeezing it so hard that Sarah felt pain, but she didn't dare pull it away. "Hey, you!" a voice called. He was hoarse and tired, but there was no threat in him. "What are you doing here?" Sarah still couldn't answer, afraid that this stranger might be a trap. However, Lena, becoming more helpless by the moment, said almost in a whisper, "Help me, please." The man took a step towards them and stopped, spreading his arms, as if to show that he was not going to cause harm. "I saw you running. You need shelter. Follow me quickly." Sarah hesitated. Someone else's voice, especially in this situation, could be dangerous. But she knew they had no choice. The killer could be nearby, and if they didn't hide, they'd be caught. So, despite all her doubts, she made up her mind. "Come on. But if you betray us..." Her voice trailed off, but the stranger just nodded. They followed him through the forest, feeling his confident footsteps. Everything was quiet except for their breathing and footsteps on the forest floor. Finally, they came to a small hut, barely visible in the dark. The wooden door was ajar, and the man invited them inside. "Quickly, come in," he said, looking around. They entered, and the door slammed shut behind them with a thud. Sarah and Lena looked around. It was a strange place. There were old blankets on the floor, and in the corner there was a metal stove that barely drew heat. There was a smell of dampness and something rotting in the air. "Sit down," the man said, pointing to a chair. "You need to take a break." They sat down. Lena was pale, her lips were trembling with fear, and her eyes were full of tears. Sarah tried to collect her thoughts. This person could be anyone, a hunter, a refugee, or even another victim. But he had clearly helped them, and that meant something. "Why did you save us?" Sarah finally asked. The man sitting opposite paused for a moment before answering. "I've been in this forest for many years too. This man, he's not the first one I've seen. And it won't be the last one if you don't stop it. But I can't do it alone." Sarah felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. This man, did that mean the man knew their stalker? "We have to get out of here," Lena whispered, clenching her hands into fists. "You're right," the stranger replied. "But to escape, we need to know where he is first. And he won't back down so easily." Sarah looked at him in the dark. His face was hidden in the semi-darkness, but she sensed that his words were not just a warning. He knew it wasn't just a wild game with a stalker. It was more than that, and they were all caught up in an unimaginable nightmare. Suddenly, a familiar sound was heard in the forest, thudding footsteps. The man stood up, taking a quick glance out the window. He darted to the door.